Well, what did he do? He immediately banned the Communist Party. And by July, he banned all other parties. The Nazi Party was the only legal political party in Germany. All labor unions were brought under Nazi control. The national government assumed all regional authority. Goering was able to say at this point, the law and the will of the Führer, Führer, just German for leader, are one. And so at this point, yeah, you might say the law and the will of the Führer are one, precisely because Hitler now actually, under the law, had all possible power. All executive power, all legislative power. That was part of the process of defederalization, of taking power away from the cities and towns and regions and bringing it all to Berlin, and then putting Hitler completely in charge of that. Well, in order to enforce this physically, there were 3 security systems. It wasn't enough to have one secret police, as Lenin had had, as Stalin had had. There were actually 3 different units of something like a secret police. 3 different security systems that competed against one another. The idea was that by keeping them at odds with one another, Hitler would remain in control. After all, there's a danger in having one secret police under you. They could always rebel against you. But if you've got several competing, then you can use one against the other. That's what Hitler did very cleverly. These 3 groups were, first of all, the SA, the Brownshirts. Secondly, the SS, the Blackshirts, a much more elite group. And then the elite of the elite, the Gestapo. So what were they like? The Brownshirts, that was an organization run by Ernst Röhm. It was over 1 million people by the fall of 1933, with 3.5 million in reserve. It was something like a domestic army, okay? A huge quasi-military force that operated below the radar within Germany itself. The Brownshirts were Hitler's enforcers. They were something like a domestic police force, but that really is to give them too much credit. They didn't have the training of ordinary police. They were really sort of paramilitary groups. And they practiced brutal open street violence. Now, they were growing so rapidly that Hitler began to think of Röhm and the SA as a threat. And so, on July 2nd, 1934, what has become known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had Strasser, Röhm, other political opponents shot. There were somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 victims, all in one night. So no one could warn anyone else. These groups simply went around and killed the key leaders of the SA, and anyone else, for that matter, who was perceived to be an enemy of Hitler's. This is, by the way, one of the things that had a big impact on Stalin. Before this, Stalin's emphasis was on show trials, on legal proceedings, on things trying to justify pushing other people out of power. After this, he realized, I could have just had them shot. And this is when Stalin actually moved toward much more just shooting people in the head, rather than playing all these complex political games. Now, the SS was a more elite group. Its leader was Heinrich Himmler. He headed up the SS, the Blackshirts, this highly trained elite. There were 52,000 of them, compared to over 1 million of the Brownshirts in 1933. And then the Gestapo were the elite chosen out of category. The Gestapo were the innermost circle, the most trusted security force, Hitler's own sort of private secret police. And not terribly secret, they wanted people to be in fear of the Gestapo. And so here you see the Gestapo running with dogs in chase of someone who was perceived to be an enemy of the regime. Hitler took power at the end of January in 1933, but by March he already had opened and was operating concentration camps for his political enemies. The very first one opened at Dachau for 5,000 prisoners. Those people were charged with, notice, suspicion of activities inimical to the state. First of all, suspicion. They hadn't yet done anything, they were suspected. They weren't convicted of anything, they were really suspected. Secondly, what does it mean, activities inimical to the state? That's an extremely flexible designation. It really allowed Hitler to imprison anyone he wanted to imprison for any reason at all. You're an enemy of the state, we lock you away, at least you're suspected. If you're just suspected of this, we don't actually have to prove anything. And conditions in the camps were brutal. There were additional punishments, floggings, death for holding meetings, making speeches, forming cliques, loitering, collecting information about the camps. All of those things were punishable by death. And so the camps were, at this early stage, kept a secret. People simply disappeared. And so Hitler was beginning to build something like his own internal gulag. These were not yet death camps. They were to become death camps, But initially, they were really prisoner of war camps, something like the Gulag camps in the Soviet Union. Now, the motto of Churchill's book on the 1930s, The Gathering Storm, is this. And he's asking us a different question. Not how did Hitler rise to power, but how was it possible for the Allied powers to let all of this happen and let the world slide toward war? How did it happen that intelligent, well-meaning leaders in France and in Britain permitted a series of events that led to the Second World War? And so his motto is this: how the English-speaking peoples, through their unwisdom, carelessness, and good nature, allowed the wicked to rearm. And that's what his book, The Gathering Storm, is really about. It is an amazing story. Goebbels himself put it this way in 1940. He could scarcely believe it. And this is, in a way, the question that motivates Churchill and that motivates us now. Up to now, we've succeeded in leaving the enemy in the dark concerning Germany's real goals. Just as before 1932, our domestic foes never saw where we were going, or our oath of legality was just a trick. We wanted to come to power legally, but we did not want to use power legally. They could have suppressed us. They could have arrested a couple of us in 1925, and that would have been that, the end. No, they let us through the danger zone. People let Hitler out of prison, for example, and editorialized in the newspapers about it. Oh, I'm sure he'll just return to Austria, nothing more will ever be heard of him. They let people through the danger zone. That's exactly how it was in foreign policy, too. In 1933, a French premier ought to have said, and if I had been the French premier, I would have said it, the new Reich Chancellor is the man who wrote Mein Kampf, which says this and that. The man cannot be tolerated in our vicinity, either he disappears or we march. But they didn't do it. They left us alone and let us slip through the risky zone. And we were able to sail around all dangerous reefs, and then, when we were done and well-armed, better than they, then they started the war. And indeed, that's a very fair description of what happened. There were several points, multiple points really, where the Allies could have intervened and stopped Hitler, deposed him from power. And really, they didn't even have to directly depose him. People within Germany were ready to do it for them. All they had to do was take certain steps to oppose moves that Hitler made, and they would not do it. They let Hitler get through the danger zone, as he puts it, again and again. And finally, once the balance of power was tipped dramatically in Hitler's favor, it was only then that England and France actually committed to war. Well, here was Hitler's plan. Oh, question, yeah.
I was just going to ask, you know, Hitler's Austrian. He's not German by birth. He's from a completely different empire. Why did he choose Germany? Like, what made him go towards Germany?
All right, good question. Hitler was Austrian. So part of the reason had to do with his view about race and about ethnic groups. He saw the German peoples as themselves having a unity. And so he thought of himself, even though he was from Austria, as somebody who spoke German, somebody who viewed himself as German. And so he thought that the boundaries that separated German peoples from one another were artificial and actually unjust. The boundary between Germany and Austria-Hungary was something that itself you might have objected to, but before the war, Hitler was fighting for, well, actually it wasn't. I guess he was fighting for Austria. And then what happened, basically, is that after the war, the idea was supposed to be the boundaries would be redrawn according to these ethnic and linguistic groups. But then why is Austria not unified with Germany? In fact, within Germany, there is this sense of, I guess, how German you are. People from northern Germany, around Hamburg, actually speak a somewhat different dialect from those spoken in Bavaria and Austria. And often the Bavarians and the Austrians think of themselves as the true Germans. That's known as High German as opposed to Low German. And so Hitler identified with High German, and that sort of, they thought of themselves as more German than most of the Germans. And so that's part of the answer. It's something referred to actually in The Wasteland, where he's talking about a Lithuanian saying, look, no, I'm a real German, you know. And often these people who spoke German but were outside of Germany proper viewed themselves as more German than the Germans. So I think that's part of the answer. Part of it may be that there was a bit of an inferiority complex there. Hitler himself sort of probably felt like being an Austrian, yeah, he was not, maybe not, there was this creeping suspicion he wasn't fully German. And so that too propelled him to try to be more German than the Germans. But anyway, it's a good question, because from any point of view, he really was sort of an outsider. What was he doing here, and why was he doing this instead of trying to rise to power in Austria? Partly because he sensed that it was the Germans who had this frustration. Now, his goal was really to, well, do what? Take control of Germany, but then try to unite the German peoples under one boundary. That meant pushing out the boundaries of Germany, so that entailed abrogating the Treaty of Versailles, pushing it aside, making Germany the chief power of Central Europe, which if you included German-speaking peoples from Austria and Czechoslovakia and Poland and even Romania and so on, this was a large group of people, so it would naturally have been, if you expand the boundaries in that way, the chief power of Central Europe. Then his goal was to destroy the Soviet Union, which is, he thought, the major threat, both in the sense that it had land he thought the German peoples really ought to have, and also in the sense that he thought of communism as the great rival to his variety of socialism. Then he would establish a continental empire, stretching all the way from the Urals throughout the rest of Europe, and then eventually, he thought, long after his own death, his followers would have to fight the United States for world domination. That was the long-term plan. And it didn't quite work out that way, though he did do pretty well at following it down for a while. Well, why did the Western powers show such blindness toward his eventual intentions? After all, he did spell out that plan in Mein Kampf. That's written down. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. They just had to read what he said. They just had to listen to the speeches. Why didn't people pay attention? Well, I think Roy has shown you this photograph of diplomats who were negotiating the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was 1928. And what were they doing, these international diplomats? They were outlawing war. The Kellogg-Briand Pact outlawed war. Here's what it said in the crucial articles. The high contracting parties solemnly declare, in the names of their respective peoples, that they condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies, and renounce it as an instrument of national policy in their relations with one another. So they basically say, war is bad, we promise not to engage in it. The second thing is, they will resolve all disputes and conflicts, no matter what nature they are, in only peaceful means, okay, just by pacific means. Now, how much impact do you think it has to outlaw war? Yeah, none, okay? And indeed, it had very little practical effect. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Germany seized the Rhineland, Austria and Czechoslovakia in the late 30s, and so you might say, wow, big deal. But actually, it did have an impact later. People were prosecuted for war crimes, and it was under the Kellogg-Briand Act. So it did give a foundation for prosecuting war crimes later. It didn't prevent people from going to war, but at least it enabled things that allowed them in some cases to be found guilty of aggression. Now, in 1933, the British Prime Minister proposed what became known as the Mcdonald Plan to reduce the French army from 500,000 people to 200,000, allowing the Germans to increase to 200,000. They already had reserves of over 1 million. It restricted the size of new guns and restricted all air forces to 500 planes. In fact, basically what the Mcdonald Plan was, look, the Germans are becoming really quite bellicose and starting to rebuild their military. This is really quite worrisome. What can we do to prevent it? I know. Let's cut our own armed forces by 60%. Maybe that will convince them we're peaceful peoples, and they will see no need to rearm. Well, yes, I'm putting on this accent partly to indicate, well, I admit partly to indicate the foolishness of this plan. But anyway, that was the idea. Look, Hitler's worried about us attacking him. That's why he's building up the armed services. If we just reduce the size of our armed forces, surely he'll recognize this as a gesture of peace. Churchill said it was like being smothered by a feather bed. In any event, Hitler rejected it. Hitler said, no, that is unacceptable. Okay, Hitler demanded much more radical reductions. He withdrew from the disarmament conference that went along with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and he also withdrew from the League of Nations. So he acted as if this plan to reduce Allied forces by 60% was somehow an outrageous insult to Germany. Well, if you're a British politician, what do you do after that? You offer even greater concessions. And so the attitude is one we've already encountered a bit in the Bloomsbury group. Forster, remember, said, I hate the idea of causes, and if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. Sometimes that actually got expressed as pacifism. Sometimes it got expressed as loyalty to Stalin and even Soviet espionage. But it more frequently got expressed in this sort of attitude. Here is George Lansbury, the Labour Party leader, in June of 1933. I would close every recruiting station, disband the army, and disarm the air force. I would abolish the whole dreadful equipment of war and say to the world, do your worst. Okay, that was the Labour Party, basically in favor of unilateral disarmament. Clement Attlee, a later Labour Party leader, said, we are ultimately opposed to anything in the nature of rearmament. Okay, so just getting rid of things, no matter what Hitler did, the view in Britain was, we will do nothing to rearm ourselves. The Times dismissed Hitler's speeches about seeking a greater Germany through military power. He said, this is just rhetoric intended for home consumption. The Oxford Union in 1933 debated the question that this House refuses in any circumstances to fight for king and country. That resolution was approved overwhelmingly by the people in attendance at the Oxford Union. Hitler noticed them. Hitler paid attention and said, look, we can do anything we want. The British will not fight. Leaders are championing disarmament, say they will not rearm under any circumstances. People are approving resolutions that they will not fight under any circumstances for anything. Well, the march toward war then was well on. Various parties were beginning to ally to try to, well, in diplomatic ways, counter some of Hitler's power. In June, Mussolini met Hitler in Venice, and his reaction was, no, mi piace. Okay, I don't like him. He does not please me. He's a garrulous monk. But a few years later, they were to be in alliance. The Night of the Long Knives was accompanied by, just a few weeks later, the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss being assassinated by German agents. And then that December, there was a clash between Italian and Ethiopian soldiers in Africa, at a place called Walwal. Now, Paul Johnson, a historian, has said about this, it's of the essence of geopolitics, to be able to distinguish between different degrees of evil. You've got Mussolini and these adventures in Africa on the one hand, and that's bad. Mussolini was clearly acting as an aggressor here. But then you have Hitler, much worse. And basically, people were unable to draw that sort of distinction. Remember the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. One of these regions, the Saar, was supposed to vote about whether or not to reunite with Germany. Well, it did vote in January of 1935, 90% to return to Germany, which is what happened. Hitler shortly thereafter repudiated the Versailles Treaty, and then an Anglo-German naval treaty gave Germany the right to 35% of British naval strength, parity in submarines. Now that's important, hugely important. Britain has the world's largest navy at the time. And so to have even 35% of that was actually an immense navy. And parity in submarines, really all of the other ships were to some extent vulnerable due to German U-boats. Hitler, by that point, had reached Air Force parity with Britain. Well, Hitler then instituted the draft. And Britain was all concerned about the Ethiopian situation and Italy's aggression there. Well, Stanley Baldwin became British Prime Minister, and Churchill puts his view this way, which I've balked of it as Stanley Baldwin's salute. Churchill said the Prime Minister had declared that sanctions meant war. Secondly, it was resolved there must be no war. And third, he decided upon sanctions. But it excluded oil. He didn't really want to piss the Italians off. It included only things that Italy didn't actually need to conduct its war effort. Well, of course, then it didn't hamper Italy's war effort in Africa. In fact, if anything, it stimulated the Italian war spirit. It enraged Italy, actually, and it emboldened the enemies of Britain. But in addition to that, it drove Mussolini into Hitler's arms. Mussolini at that point viewed himself as an ally of France and England. But after this, since they lined up against him, he decided to ally himself with Hitler. And so it turned Mussolini into an enemy. Well, 1936, Hitler remilitarizes the Rhine in violation of treaties. And he admitted if the French had marched at that point, we would have had to withdraw. We were far weaker. But they didn't do it. The generals, moreover, in Germany kept telling Hitler, don't do it, don't do it. They're going to call your bluff. But they didn't. And so it strengthened Hitler's hand against his own generals. Now, the British reaction to this was actually amazing. Here is Lloyd George. In my judgment, Hitler's greatest crime was not the breach of the treaty, because there was provocation. What provocation? There was no provocation. The provocation was, well, the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles itself. And so what you have happening here is, I think, a combination of things. British politicians, first of all, not really believing in the country they're leading, and secondly, believing themselves that the terms of that treaty were unfair. And so throughout this period of the 1930s, Hitler casts aside one aspect of the treaty after another, and they admit, basically, look, it was unfair. Hitler's really right about that, so we shouldn't do anything about it. The provocation here was the provocation of 1919 and the terms of the treaty. There was nothing else that could plausibly have been considered a provocation. Well, Britain nevertheless started constructing radar stations, which turned out to be very wise. Hitler ordered the Austrian Nazi Party to step up activities at the same time that he promised not to interfere in Austrian affairs. He then made alliances with Italy and with Japan, and here you see him riding along in a car with Mussolini to cement their alliance. There they are together. Well, at that point, I'm going to skip the Spanish Civil War. Apologies for that. By 1938, Hitler had taken control of the army and marched the army into Austria. Here you see a woman crying, saluting the incoming German troops. In 1938, events began to develop rapidly. There was a crisis in Czechoslovakia. A lot of people, especially along the borders, and what today would be the Czech Republic, were German speakers. They were in what was called the Sudetenlands. They began demanding independence from Czechoslovakia. Well, the Sudeten leader fled to Germany, and Chamberlain flew to Munich. He was convinced that Hitler was somebody he could negotiate a solution to the crisis with. Here was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word, Chamberlain said. Now, in fact, this is absolutely astounding. On the day that Chamberlain announced that he was going to fly to Munich, the German generals had decided they had had enough of Hitler's risk. They had a plan to arrest him that very night. And it was then, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that Chamberlain announced his plan to fly to Munich to try to negotiate a solution. That led the German generals to call off the coup and to say, well, let's wait and see what happens. If Chamberlain had waited 1 day, Hitler would have been out of power. If he had not made this offer at all, Hitler would have been out of power. A few hours separated the coup, which was to take place, I think, at 8 o'clock in the evening, from his announcement. 4 hours. If it had been delayed by just 4 hours, Hitler would have been arrested and imprisoned, and the other German generals would have taken charge. However, Chamberlain flew to Munich and came back with an agreement. He said, I believe this is peace for our time. Hitler publicly said, this is the last territorial demand I will make in Europe. Privately, he said to his top people, our opponents are little worms. And so here is the area, the greenish area within Czechoslovakia. That was the Sudetenland. As you can see, it's a large area. Here is Hitler and Chamberlain there on the far left, signing the agreement. And here's Chamberlain's announcement when he came back. How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying to gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. I am myself a man of peace to the depths of my soul. What do you mean, faraway people of which we know nothing? Here is a little map, London to Prague. It's the same distance as Austin to Atlanta. Okay? A distant people of whom we know nothing. It's really not very far away at all. Moreover, Czechoslovakia was one of Britain's chief allies. Here he is announcing peace for our time. But in fact, it is astounding. The generals were preparing to arrest Hitler. After this, he became undisputed master. Churchill was one of the only people who saw it for what it was. We've sustained a total and unmitigated defeat. It was also a crucial turning point. Czechoslovakia had the second greatest military in Europe. And so transferring the Czechs from one side of the equation to the other totally transformed the balance of power. Britain, France, and Czechoslovakia together were far more powerful than Germany. But Germany and Czechoslovakia together were far more powerful than Britain and France. And so it was a dramatic turning point in the preparation for war.